What if the very first words human beings ever wrote were never meant as a beginning at all? What if they were the last pages of a book that was already ending, pressed into wet clay by people who knew their time was running out? Out in the deserts of southern Iraq, where the heat feels ancient and the silence is heavier than the sand, the ruins of old cities still seem to be holding their breath. Beneath broken walls and wind-carved mounds lie tens of thousands of clay fragments. At first glance, they look like nothing more than shattered bricks, each one scarred with tiny wedge-shaped marks that almost resemble bird tracks crossing mud after rain. Those marks are cuneiform, and inside them are the oldest continuous records of human thought that we have ever found. But here is where things start to get strange. These are not the clumsy baby steps of a young civilization just figuring out how to write. They do not read like beginnings at all. Before we go any further, if you enjoy long, slow stories where history refuses to line up neatly, where the evidence argues with the textbooks, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening in the dark somewhere, on a couch, in a truck cab, in a dorm room, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I like to imagine this mystery stretching quietly across time zones while you drift towards sleep. The discovery of those tablets did not start with treasure chests and trumpets. It started with dust. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists were working near the ancient site of Uruk in what is now southern Iraq. To most outsiders, it was just a low, dusty landscape, broken by strange, artificial-looking hills. But as diggers cut into those mounds, they realized they were standing on the tops of buildings, the roofs of rooms that had been sealed for thousands of years. When they broke through, they did not find gold. They found storage chambers packed with clay tablets, stacked like files in an archive. The tablets had baked hard under the Iraqi sun for more than 4,000 years. Now they were being pulled out one by one, brushed off, and shipped to museums in London, Berlin, and Istanbul. Each tablet, no bigger than a paperback book, was covered in those tight wedge impressions. At first, nobody could read them. The script was like nothing anyone alive had ever seen. But as linguists slowly cracked the code, a picture began to emerge that made historians very uncomfortable. These were not practice sentences from a new writing class. They were fully formed records, tax accounts, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, legal contracts, hymns and prayers to gods whose names had not been spoken aloud in 4,000 years, business letters, delivery receipts, school exercises, even jokes. Whoever had written these things was not experimenting with symbols. They were already fluent. The people behind this script eventually got a name in our textbooks, the Sumerians. And the moment that word entered the story, something deep in our timeline began to wobble. Because Sumer does not show up the way we expect a civilization to appear, it does not creep slowly into view. It arrives already wearing a crown. Around 3500 BCE, cities begin to rise across southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In archaeological terms, this happens almost overnight. We see urban layouts with streets and districts, monumental temples and stepped platforms, advanced irrigation networks feeding huge fields. A mathematical system based on the number 60, the same system we still use right now every time we say there are 60 minutes in an hour or 360 degrees in a circle. Their cuneiform script, in its earliest known form, already uses more than 700 distinct symbols. Their temple complexes are lined up precisely with important points in the sky, marking solstices and key star risings. Their trade links reach from the Persian Gulf all the way toward the Mediterranean coast. This is not how civilization is supposed to start. In the usual story, progress is slow and messy. Stone tools lead, step by step, toward copper and then bronze. Small farming villages gradually grow into towns and then into cities. Simple picture writing slowly turns into more abstract signs and finally into full alphabets. There are mistakes, dead ends, rough drafts everywhere you look. But Sumer feels different. It is like walking into a play and realizing you never saw rehearsals. The actors are already on stage, hitting every line, working from a script that must have existed long before opening night. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to explain this. Some say we simply have not dug up the earlier stages yet, that erosion and flooding and time have erased the long, awkward climb that must have come before. Others suggest that Sumer learned from older neighbors, cultures whose remains lie under the sea or beneath later cities. But the Sumerians themselves offer a very different explanation, written in the same wedge marks on the same clay. Again and again, a simple phrase appears in their inscriptions, on temple walls, on foundation stones, on tablets that record royal building projects. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. To the Sumerian mind, kingship is not something humans invented. It is something that arrived. It descended. And those early texts describe what happened next in a quiet, almost matter-of-fact way. This is the restoration of what was before, not invention, restoration. As if everything they built, every canal they dug, every temple they raised, was not a brand new idea, but an attempt to rebuild something older that had been lost. So I want you to picture yourself for a moment, not out in the desert, but alone in a museum archive late at night, when the public galleries are locked and the air smells faintly of dust and cardboard and old paper. A curator brings out a padded tray. You pull on thin cotton gloves, and resting there in the foam is one of these tablets from Uruk or Nippur or Ur, still faintly the colour of the river mud it was made from. You lift it carefully. The clay feels cool and slightly rough. Across its surface, hundreds of tiny wedges catch the light. Each one was pressed with a reed stylus held in a human hand that has been dust for 5,000 years. If you tilt that tablet in the light, past the script itself, you can sometimes see something even more intimate. Along the edges where the scribe held it, there are shallow holes and ridges pressed into the clay, fingerprints, thumbprints, the texture of skin from a person who lived before the pyramids, before the great palaces of Crete, before Chinese dynasties or Mesoamerican temples. That scribe sat in a quiet room, probably in a city with canals and crowded streets, and wrote something they believed mattered enough to outlive them. Then they set the tablet aside to dry, never imagining it would end up under glass in a museum on the far side of the planet, stared at through layers of language, time, and security glass. What were they saving? Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Sumerian cities, some are just routine notes, lists of barley rations for workers, delivery records for sheep and goats, receipts for temple offerings. These are the emails and spreadsheets of the ancient world. But sitting right next to those everyday documents are texts you would not expect to see at the very dawn of writing. Astronomical tables that track the movements of Venus with an accuracy we did not rediscover until the age of telescopes. Multiplication tables that show students how to calculate compound interest. Medical manuals that describe simple surgeries and prescribe specific plants for specific illnesses. Hymns and stories that describe how humans were shaped from clay mixed with a divine ingredient, then adjusted and improved over generations. Running through almost all of it is a theme the Sumerians never stop repeating. There was a time before everything they knew, a world before a great flood, a period when rulers lived for impossible spans of time. an age when beings that came from the heavens taught humanity how to read the sky, measure the earth, and structure society. It is easy to wave this away as mythology, old stories, sacred imagination, except the same flood and the same shape of story keep turning up far outside Mesopotamia. Versions of it appear on Akkadian tablets, in Hebrew scripture, in Hindu texts, in Mesoamerican codices. The names change, the gods change, the details twist to fit local landscapes. But the pattern stays strangely stable. There was a world before. A catastrophe came. A few survived. Knowledge was preserved, then handed on as people rebuilt. In the early 1900s, an archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was digging at Ur, another Sumerian city, when his team ran into something that forced everyone to look again at those old flood stories. They were cutting down through the layers of the city, looking for the earliest signs of human settlement: ash from ancient fires, broken pottery, stone tools, the usual trail of human life. Then it all stopped. The workers hit a layer of clean, sterile clay. No charcoal, no bones, no tools, just smooth silt, more than 2 meters thick, wrapped around the site like a band. Woolley thought they had reached natural soil, the untouched base beneath the city. The logical move was to stop. Instead, he told his workers to keep going. 2.5 meters deeper, the artifacts started again. More pottery, more tools. Signs of another settlement, older than the city above, sealed away under that thick clay blanket. The excavation profile looked like a sandwich. On top, a city. In the middle, a featureless layer of flood deposited silt. Underneath, a different city, from an earlier time. Woolley realized this was not the slow build-up from seasonal flooding. This was not mud from normal river cycles. It was the residue of a single violent event that had swept across the land, scouring it clean and leaving nothing but mud in its wake. He called it a catastrophic flood. Newspapers, of course, called it Noah's flood. The headline was louder than the data, but the core finding was solid. Between two human occupations lay the fingerprint of a massive inundation. Ur was not the only place where this pattern appeared. At Shuruppak, another Sumerian city, archaeologists found the same kind of clean clay layer, roughly 2 meters thick, sitting between older and newer levels of habitation. At Kish, they saw a similar break in the record. At Eridu, which Sumerian tradition treated as the first city, there were signs of abandonment and rebuilding after serious flooding. Not every site shows this kind of layer. Some cities were built on higher ground that the water never reached. Others were founded after the event. But across the flat, low-lying plains of southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates wander and flood, the evidence lines up around the same period the Sumerians were talking about when they told their flood stories. The flood they remembered was not global. It did not swallow mountains or cover every inch of the planet. But in the world they knew, the land between those rivers, it might as well have. If your entire universe is that fertile strip of silt and mud, and one year the rivers rise higher than they ever have, break their banks, and do not recede for months, drowning every field, every village, every temple, then for you the world has ended. When the water finally falls, you are starting again on a blank, muddy canvas. The Sumerian tablets describe exactly that feeling. A before and after, an interruption so deep that everything had to be rebuilt from whatever fragments survived. This is what makes their behavior after the flood so interesting. When archaeologists excavated the Great Temple Mound at Uruk, they expected crude beginnings, the architectural equivalent of sketches. Instead, they found defensive walls that ran for kilometers, water systems built with careful mathematical planning, a temple complex aligned to track the winter solstice, so that the sun rose in a precise notch in the structure on a precise day each year. In the ruins of a collapsed library, they uncovered tens of thousands of tablets, enough material to reconstruct the daily life of a whole city-state. Trade accounts, grain inventories, court cases, ritual instructions, star charts, school texts. Yet, scattered through these records, you do not see the Sumerians bragging that they invented any of this. They say something else. On royal inscriptions and temple dedications carved into stone, a line appears over and over again. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not creation. As if the people rebuilding after that flood did not see themselves as pioneers at all, they saw themselves as archivists, conservators, individuals trying to salvage an older blueprint they believed came from a time before the water. In a quiet gallery in Berlin, there is a small clay cylinder sitting under glass. The script winding around it records the dedication of a temple to Inanna, the goddess associated with the evening star. It praises the king. It describes the building, but hidden among the formulaic lines is that same phrase again, the restoration of what was before. And if you lean close enough to the glass, you can see the human trace behind the piety. Just above the base of the cylinder, pressed into the clay before it dried, there are fingerprints. The person who shaped it did not mean to leave them there. They were simply doing their job, turning the cylinder in their hands so they could write on each side. Those ridges and loops belonged to someone who believed they were saving something, not inventing it, preserving it. Maybe that is part of why these tablets still call to us across 5,000 years. They were not meant to announce a new age. They were meant to hold on to the memory of an age that had already vanished. A world so thoroughly erased by time, water, and collapse that only fragments remained. Fragments pressed into clay by hands that understood the weight of being the last generation that remembers. At night, after the museum lights have dimmed and the visitors have gone home, those tablets sit in rows and stacks, breathing in the regulated air. Each one is a sealed time capsule. Each one is a message from people who knew, with unsettling clarity, that they were rebuilding on top of ruins. We like to think of ourselves as standing at the forward edge of history, always pushing into something new. But when you listen to the Sumerian tablets long enough, a different possibility creeps in. Maybe we are standing at the far end of a story that started long before anyone etched a mark into clay. A story that the Sumerians tried, in their own quiet, wedge-shaped way, to keep from disappearing completely. So picture the story winding quietly back to where it started, back to the clay, back to the moment when silence was first broken with marks that could outlive a heartbeat. One of the strangest qualities of these tablets is how stubborn they are. Clay sounds fragile, but once it has been baked by fire or sun, it becomes almost impossible to destroy by accident. Clay tablets do not burn the way wood or parchment does. If a library in ancient Sumer went up in flames, the shelves turned to ash, the roof collapsed, the wooden doors vanished. The tablets inside did not die. The fire actually baked them harder, like pottery in a kiln. Floods that melted mud brick walls could not dissolve them. The buildings would slump and sink. Roof beams would rot. Whole streets would blur back into clay. Yet, inside that melted mess, the tablets stayed intact, waiting for someone with a shovel 5,000 years later. So memory survived not because someone planned a perfect archive, but because disaster accidentally built one. Fire hardened the records. Flood buried them in silt. Time packed them under layers of dirt. Every attempt to erase left something behind. In the heat of a southern Iraqi summer, where the air shimmers and temperatures can push past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the ruins of Uruk still break the flat desert in broken shapes, lines of wall, platforms of brick, traces of streets that once held crowds. The sand never really rests here. It moves with the wind, covering one corner, uncovering another, climbing over fallen walls, sliding away from carved foundations. Beneath that shifting skin, the clay waits in dark, sealed rooms that once stored records no one had read since long before the time of Alexander or Caesar. When the first archaeologists went out in the 1870s and 1880s, with names like Hormuz Rassam, Ernest de Sazek, Robert Calderway, they had no idea what they were about to pull out of the ground. They were hoping for statues that could stand impressively in European museums, carved steles, gold, anything that looked dramatic. What they got instead, in room after room, was stacks of tablets, thousands of them. Most looked painfully boring: administrative debris, receipts, inventories, contracts, the kind of thing a museum visitor will walk right past. For a long time, that is exactly how many people treated them. Crates of tablets were stored in basements. A few dozen were selected for display. The rest waited in drawers and boxes while a handful of specialists worked slowly through the script. Only when the translations began to pile up did the pattern become clear. Mixed in with the ration lists from Nippur, the canal logs from Lagash, and the grain accounts from Ur, there were glimpses of a civilization that sounded anything but primitive. A single tablet might list barley, oil, and wool rations for temple workers. The next would show a student in a scribal school practicing multiplication, copying out square and cube tables. Another would contain a medical recipe using thyme, cedar, and fermented barley to treat an infection. In the same archive, you could find hymns praising Inanna, instructions for predicting lunar eclipses, the record of a legal dispute about a property boundary, and a farmer's almanac explaining when to open irrigation channels based on seasonal floods. This was not the rough baby talk of a culture just learning to write. It was a society already fluent in every type of written knowledge. The earliest Sumerian tablets we have, from around 3500 to 3200 BCE, already carry complex content. From the moment cuneiform appears, it is capable of holding law, math, poetry, science, and accounting. The script itself arrives in a way that makes linguists uneasy. In other parts of the ancient world, writing systems show their growing pains. Egyptian hieroglyphs begin as simple pictures and only slowly become more abstract and flexible. Early Chinese characters start with rough pictographs carved into bone, then evolve into more stylized forms on bronze, and only much later resemble the scripts used today. Even our alphabet can be traced backward through Phoenician and Proto-Canaanite forms, one small change at a time. Everywhere else, you can follow the trail. You can see the messy middle stages with extra signs that later disappear, inconsistent spellings, competing symbol sets. You can watch people experiment. Cuneiform looks different. From its first clear appearance, the system is already dense. Hundreds of signs, values that can be logograms, representing whole words, or syllabic signs, representing sounds. A hybrid system that normally takes centuries to refine shows up ready-made in multiple cities at the same time. There is no wide scatter of awkward experimental tablets where scribes are still figuring out how to write complex ideas. There is no obvious proto-cuneiform phase where everything is tentative and inconsistent. Archaeologists and linguists refer to this as an anomaly. They do not mean magic. They mean there is a missing staircase they would very much like to find. The strangeness is not limited to the writing. It extends to what the writing describes. Among the tablets from Uruk is a cadastral survey, essentially a land registry. It maps fields, irrigation channels, and property boundaries across an entire city-state. To produce that document, you need more than literacy. You need geometry, standard units, surveying techniques, and an administration capable of tracking land and ownership over long periods. From the very earliest layers, those pieces are all there. Meanwhile, at Eridu, which later tradition remembered as the first city, the excavated temples contain hymns that refer to even older temples, older gods, older rituals. The priests of Eridu did not claim to be inventing anything. Their own texts describe them as maintaining a pattern that was handed down. One inscription from the temple of Enki reads like a quiet confession. The house whose foundation was laid in the sacred place, whose ancient designs are carried forward from distant days, not built for the first time, not established here, carried forward. For a long time, scholars pushed this aside as religious rhetoric. It is normal for institutions to claim ancient roots. Churches, dynasties, and universities all like to pretend they have always been there. Saying your temple was built according to a plan from distant days is a way of making it sound important. The problem is that this modest, almost apologetic wording shows up everywhere in Sumerian texts, not just on one temple wall. At Lagash, a boundary stone recording a treaty between rival city-states does not say a new border was invented. It says a border established by a god in ancient times was restored again. At Nippur, a center for religious and scribal training, temple inventories list sacred objects that are described as coming from before the time of memory. Clay cones buried in foundations explain that the builders were renovating structures whose first designers were already forgotten. You start to see a pattern. The Sumerians do not present themselves as founders. They present themselves as caretakers. They never claim we are the first. They keep insisting we are the ones who remember. This would make more sense if there were clear ancestors behind them. If the archaeology showed a long line of gradually advancing cultures leading up to Sumer, then their humility would be just that, cultural style. The trouble is that in the very same region, the earlier Ubaid culture looks nothing like a proto-Sumer. The Ubaid settlements are small farming villages. Their pottery is simple, their architecture is modest, there is no sign of monumental building or long-distance trade networks. Then, in a relatively short span, the picture changes. Cities appear, temples rise, written records start, backed up by math and law and astronomy. There is a gap where we expect a long staircase of development. You can stand in an Egyptian museum and walk down that staircase in your mind, from the Great Pyramids back to earlier dynasties, and then back again to pre-dynastic graves filled with simple goods. You can see the craft and complexity growing step by step. In the Indus Valley, you can trace the growth of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro from earlier farming sites. In China, you can move from Shang bronzes back to the pottery and villages that led to them. The general pattern is clear. Villages become towns. Towns become cities. Each layer leaves debris. Sumer breaks that rhythm. When archaeologists dig deep into Sumerian sites, they do not find the same long climb. They find something closer to a jump. The earliest large layer in Uruk already covers hundreds of hectares. The city walls already stretch for kilometers. The temple platforms already require advanced knowledge of construction and weight distribution. Inside those walls, residential areas, craft zones, and religious centers are laid out with deliberate planning. At Eridu, even the earliest shrine on the temple mound shows familiarity with standard layouts, altars, niches, and orientations. By the time we get into the clear Sumerian era, later temples there become blueprints for ziggurats that will be built centuries afterward. In Lagash, the oldest levels we can access already show a city managing intricate canal systems, with gradients calculated well enough that water flows where it is supposed to go without poisoning the soil with salt. That kind of irrigation is not trivial. You usually get it wrong many times before you get it right. Yet the failures are hard to find in the dirt. The same unsettling maturity shows up in the law. The earliest Sumerian legal fragments already distinguish between intentional and accidental harm, already calculate compensation at different levels for different social classes, already regulate contracts and inheritance in detail. This is not rough eye for an eye justice. It is a system that looks like the product of centuries of disputes, worked out and codified. Put all of that together and you get what modern researchers sometimes call the Sumerian problem. It is not only that Sumer developed quickly, it is that Sumer seems to appear on stage already knowing the script, without leaving the rehearsal notes behind. Some suggest that erosion and shifting rivers have simply hidden those notes. Others propose that the real developmental work happened somewhere else, and what we see in southern Mesopotamia are already mature colonies. But the Sumerian texts quietly suggest another possibility. They say what they are doing is restoration. They say knowledge was given. They describe themselves as preserving, not inventing. The idea sounds wild if you only hear it once. It gets harder to ignore when you realize they carved it into their foundations, wrote it into their hymns, and taught it in their schools. If you step back from Mesopotamia for a moment and look across the ancient world, a pattern shows up that feels almost comforting. Civilizations usually grow slowly. In the Nile Valley, archaeologists can trace Egypt like tree rings. At the top you have the Great Pyramids and carved temples. Below that are earlier dynasties with smaller monuments and rougher art. Keep going, and you reach pre-dynastic graves, where farmers were buried with simple pottery and a few tools. You can watch complexity climb, layer by layer, from small groups of villagers to the people who raised stone mountains for their dead. In the Indus Valley, the same story plays out. The great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro do not just appear. There are earlier farming settlements, small communities that slowly experiment with brickmaking, metalwork, and trade before anyone lays out a full-planned city with straight streets and advanced drainage. In early China, the bronzes and oracle bones of the Shang dynasty sit on top of older cultures. Pottery changes, settlement sizes grow, burial goods get more complex. You can see the staircase of development as people learn by doing, by failing, by trying again. That is how we expect civilization to work. Villages slowly become towns. Towns slowly turn into cities. Each step leaves behind broken experiments. Sumer refuses to stay on that staircase. When excavation teams dig down into the oldest substantial levels at Uruk, they do not find a modest town cautiously feeling its way into urban life. They find a city already sprawling across hundreds of hectares. The defensive walls stretch for kilometers, built with millions of mud bricks that had to be shaped, dried, carried, and fitted by an army of workers. To coordinate that, someone had to calculate volumes of brick and mortar, schedule labor crews, manage food supplies, and keep the whole operation running for years. That is not a village project. That is a kind of industrial planning. Inside those walls, the layout is not random. Neighborhoods are grouped. There are areas for industry, places where kilns and workshops cluster. There are temple districts raised up on platforms. Streets follow deliberate lines that make drainage and movement easier. The great temple of the sky god in Uruk sits on a high terrace whose foundations show careful attention to weight and stability. There is no obvious layer of collapsed prototypes underneath it where people tried and failed and tried again. At Eridu, the temple mound reveals a series of rebuilding phases, one shrine constructed on the remains of another. Even the earliest shrine is not just a random room with a flat stone. It already has the basic layout that Sumerian religious architecture will follow for centuries. a central space for the deity, side rooms for offerings, a particular orientation. By the time Eridu reaches its later phases, the temple designs are so refined that later generations use them as models for full-scale ziggurats. The builders, who lived hundreds of years afterward, treat those early plans as if they came from a trusted manual. Lagash tells the same story with water. The city depends on long canals that bend and branch across the plain. For those channels to work, you have to get the slope exactly right. If the drop is too gentle, water stalls. If it is too steep, you strip away soil and leave salt behind. You also have to negotiate with other communities that want the same water, or you end up with conflict every planting season. The earliest irrigation systems we can see around Lagash are not wild failures. They are competent, they work. Fields stay fertile for generations. That does not mean nobody ever made mistakes, but the major disasters are hard to find. By contrast, early Egyptian irrigation looks like what you expect from trial and error. Canals that silt up, basins that do not fill properly, years where the timing is off and crops suffer. Over time, the Egyptians adjust and get better. You can see the learning curve. In Sumer, the learning curve feels hidden or very short. Writing follows the same pattern. When cuneiform appears, around 34 to 3200 BCE, it arrives already dense and flexible. About 700 signs are in use. Some stand for whole words. Some stand for sounds. Scribes can write names, numbers, ideas, and even wordplay. Usually, a writing system crawls toward that kind of power. Simple pictures gradually get used in more abstract ways. Extra marks are added to clarify sound. Redundant symbols are dropped. The script smooths out over centuries. With cuneiform, the rough middle stage is strangely hard to see. There are a few earlier marks scratched into clay, but when the system fully shows up, it is already capable of handling legal arguments, star charts, and poetry. There are no long shelves of awkward half-formed signs cluttering the record. Legal texts fit the same pattern. Even the oldest Sumerian law fragments we have are surprisingly subtle. They separate crimes done on purpose from accidents. They set different penalties for different classes. They recognize debt and contracts and inheritance. This is not the first draft of justice. It is a system that looks like it has been through many rounds of real disputes. Astronomy does not creep in gently either. The observational records that survive already track Venus carefully, already note lunar eclipses in patterns that match known cycles. The temples and ziggurats that dominate Sumerian skylines are aligned with cardinal directions and important solar events with a level of accuracy that implies quiet, patient measurements taken over many years. Taken one by one, each of these things could be explained away as a lucky jump or a missing layer in the dirt. Put together, they begin to look like a pattern. Mature systems without visible scaffolding. It is this pattern that led researchers to talk about the Sumerian problem. The term does not mean that Sumer itself is a problem. It means that our usual model for how complex societies grow is not fitting comfortably here. The standard explanations lean toward two options. Either we have not found the earlier stages yet, because they are buried under river deposits or lost under modern towns, or the real development took place somewhere else, maybe on coastlines that are underwater now, and the southern Mesopotamian cities are the descendants of that hidden culture. Both options are possible. Rivers move, coastlines change, archaeology is always incomplete. But the Sumerian texts keep whispering a third possibility, one that feels uncomfortable because it moves the starting line backward in a way we do not like. They keep saying that what they built was not new. They keep saying it was based on plans and knowledge from distant days. They keep describing themselves as restorers. In the scribal schools of Nippur, where young students hunched over tablets and copied lines again and again until their stylus work was acceptable, a standard phrase shows up in some of the educational texts. From distant days the scribal art has been practiced. Not recently invented, not discovered in our time. Practiced from days beyond memory. The same phrasing appears in relation to temple construction, to rituals, to legal formulas. The Sumerians frame key parts of their culture as something handed down, not something they created from nothing. That repeated insistence would be easy to dismiss if everything about Sumer looked like a steady climb from simple beginnings. It is harder to ignore when the physical and textual record both point to a civilization that arrives in history already operating at a level that should have taken many lifetimes to reach. At this point, the question that hangs in the air is simple and heavy. If they were restoring something, what exactly were they restoring, and where did that something come from? One of the most unsettling clues about where Sumerian knowledge came from is not a temple or a ziggurat. It is a small clay prism that looks, at first glance, almost dull. In 1906, a scholar named Hermann Hilprecht was working through fragments in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He picked up a prism from the city of Nippur, about the size of a tall coffee mug, covered on all four faces with neat columns of cuneiform. It was not a hymn, not a letter, not a tax receipt. It was a list. Names, cities, reign lengths. As more fragments turned up at other sites, copies from Lhasa, from Ur, later versions from Babylon and Nineveh, it became clear that this was no ordinary list. It was a chronological record of every king who had ever ruled in Sumerian memory, stretching from a mythical first age right down into recognizable history. It became known as the Sumerian King List. The text opens with a simple but loaded statement. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not emerged from human effort, descended from somewhere above. Then comes a sequence that reads like a fantasy novel. The kings of Eridu are listed one by one, along with the lengths of their reigns. Alulim, who rules for 28,800 years. Alalga, 36,000 years. Others rule for 36,000, 43,200. In Eridu alone, 8 kings reign for spans that make modern lifetimes look microscopic. After Eridu, the list marches on through other cities: Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. Each city in turn is said to hold kingship. Each city has rulers whose reigns stretch into tens of thousands of years. And then, in a single short line, everything changes. The flood swept over. The text treats the flood as a boundary, a clean knife cut across time. After the waters, when kingship is said to descend from heaven again, it goes to Kish. From that point on, rulers have much shorter reigns. Some are still exaggerated into hundreds or 1,000 years. Eventually they slide into spans that could belong to real people, a few decades, sometimes less. What makes this document so hard to classify is that the later part of the list lines up with archaeology. Some of the kings named after the flood are independently attested in inscriptions and royal tombs. They were real rulers, or at least based on them. The early part, with its 10,000 and 40,000 year reigns, looks impossible, so the classic solution has been to split the text in two. The pre-flood section is myth. The post-flood section is history. Somewhere in the middle, legend shades into memory and then into fact. On paper, that division sounds tidy. The clay tells a messier story. If the impossible reigns were just random big numbers, it would be easy to dismiss them as poetic exaggeration, but they are not random. In the 1960s, scholars began to notice a pattern. Those huge spans are not strange at all if you speak Sumerian mathematics. The early kings do not reign for any old amount of time. Their reign lengths are clean multiples of a unit the Sumerians used for very large quantities, called a sar. One sar is 3,600. Alulim's 28,800 years equal 8 sars. Alalgar's 36,000 equal 10. Others land on 12 sars, 15 sars, and so on. In other words, the impossible numbers behave like carefully chosen units of measurement. The Sumerians did not think in base 10 the way modern calculators do. Their system was sexagesimal, based on 60 and its factors. That is why 60 minutes sit in an hour and 360 degrees wrap around a circle. Under that system, 3,600 is not just a big random value, it is 60 times 60, a square of the base. When numbers in a sacred list keep landing on such exact multiples, it begins to look like encoded information rather than wild bragging. The reigns may not represent individual lifespans at all. They may be counting cycles. The Sumerians were serious sky watchers. They tracked the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn. They knew how long it took those planets to return to the same position against the stars as seen from Earth. They recorded eclipses and recognized repeating patterns in those events. Over centuries, that kind of observation turns into long-term cycles, huge repeating periods measured in years and sars. Some researchers have suggested that the early reigns in the king list are not biographies, they are time blocks. Each king is the symbolic face of an era, a chunk of cosmic time measured in sars, 12 sars, 15 sars. The names are labels. The numbers are the point. If that is true, then the king list is preserving something much older than political memory. It becomes a vehicle for astronomical chronology, a way to carry forward knowledge of long cycles through storytelling. The only way a list like that can survive more than one disaster is if people keep copying it faithfully, even after they have forgotten what all the numbers meant. The clay itself supports this idea of careful copying. On surviving prisms and tablets, you can see where later scribes made mistakes, realized it, and corrected them. A number is miswritten, a sign is missing, a thin line crosses it out, and the proper value is squeezed into the margin. This is not how you treat a fairy tale. This is how you treat a document whose accuracy matters. The flood line in the text becomes even more interesting against this backdrop. Before that line, rains tick along in neat blocks of sars. After it, the pattern breaks. Rulers suddenly have much more human-looking lifetimes, even if they are still inflated. The number system shifts from cosmic precision to a more relatable scale. If the king list really does encode astronomical cycles in its early part, then the sentence about the flood is describing more than a physical disaster. It is marking a break in continuity. A culture that used one system to measure time is replaced by a culture that uses another. Archaeology independently shows that something like this happened in southern Mesopotamia. Layers of silt separate older settlements from later cities. The material culture changes. Pottery styles shift. Tool types adjust. There is a before and an after pressed into the dirt. The king list may be doing on clay what the flood layer does in the ground. It is freezing a memory of two very different phases of human existence, separated by catastrophe. A world where kingship followed cosmic rhythms, measured in sars, and a world where kingship followed more ordinary years. If that is the case, then the most ancient part of the king list might not belong to Sumerian civilization at all. It might be a hand-copied copy of a much older record, a piece of a time-keeping system that survived the destruction of whichever culture first created it. Imagine a later scribe in Nippur or Uruk, hunched over a tablet in a dusty room, copying a text they have been trained to treat as sacred. They know some of the names in the later portion. They have inscriptions on temple walls that mention those kings. The pre-flood section is different. No monuments from their own time bear those names. The numbers make no intuitive sense. But the text is old. The tradition says it must be preserved exactly. So they do what scribes always do. They copy. They correct errors. They pass the prism to the next generation. By the time anyone writes down the myths that share names with the king list, like the hero from Shuruppak who survives a great flood, the original meaning of the early numbers may already be fading. Story and calendar have fused. The scribes know the document is important, even if they no longer fully understand why. That quiet act of faithfulness may be why those strange rains can still be read at all. A long chain of hands, each pressing wedges into clay, each convinced that the exact value matters, carried a pattern of numbers through a disaster that erased the culture which first put them together. If that pattern truly reflects knowledge of cycles that stretch for tens of thousands of years, then the king list is doing something remarkable. It is reaching across the flood, across the gap in the dirt and the gap in memory, to keep a record of time that predates the visible houses and walls of Sumer. The king list paints a picture of a world that existed under a different sky, ruled by figures whose reigns stretch across impossible spans of time, then cut off by water. It is a striking story on its own. It becomes something else entirely when the dirt in Mesopotamia seems to agree. The question is simple. If the early part of the king list remembers a time before a catastrophic flood, can we actually see that flood in the ground? In the late 1920s, Leonard Woolley was directing excavations at Ur. His goal was to reach the earliest occupation levels of the city. To do that, his team sank a deep trench down through the ruins. Layer by layer they passed entire chapters of the city's life. Royal tombs filled with gold and elaborate grave goods, thick walls from public buildings, ash from ancient fires, broken pottery lying where people had once cooked, eaten, and cleaned. Then the human debris stopped. The workers hit a band of clean, uniform clay. It had no charcoal flecks, no broken pots, no bits of bone, no signs of human activity at all. Just smooth, water-laid silt, more than 2 meters thick. Woolley assumed this was sterile subsoil, the natural base beneath the city. That would have meant they had reached the bottom of Ur's history. The logical move at that point was to stop digging. Instead, out of stubbornness or curiosity, he told his team to cut deeper. After they went through roughly 2.5 meters of that lifeless clay, something changed. Pottery reappeared, stone tools, bones from meals long past, hearth ash, all the familiar trash of human settlement. Below the silt was another layer of human life, a different culture, a different style of artifacts, a city that had existed, ended, and been buried under mud before the later Ur was ever built. In a single trench, Woolley could see 3 distinct bands: human settlement, thick flood deposit, human settlement again. He had, in his words, a sandwich of history. That middle band was not the product of regular seasonal flooding. Ordinary river rises leave silt mixed with signs of life. Small floods come and go without erasing everything. This layer was different. It was deep, uniform, and clean. It looked like the result of a single large event, water moving fast enough and long enough to scour the landscape bare and leave a blanket of mud behind. When Woolley published his findings, he made a connection that newspapers loved. He said he had found evidence for the flood behind the story of Noah. The headline was dramatic. The reality in the trench was quieter and more precise. A local catastrophe big enough to bury a city and force people to start over on top of the wreckage. Ur was not unique. Excavations at Shuruppak, remembered in Sumerian texts as the home of a flood survivor king, revealed a similar band of sterile clay roughly 2 meters thick. Above it were houses and artifacts from later periods. Below it were older remains, same pattern. People, flood, people again. At Kish, another major Sumerian center, archaeologists found the same sequence. Cultural layers, then clean silt, then earlier occupation. At Eridu, the city that Sumerian tradition placed at the dawn of kingship, there were signs of serious flooding followed by rebuilding. Taken together, these sites show a picture of the southern Mesopotamian plain hit by a major inundation around 2900 BCE. Not every site has the layer. Some were too high to be drowned. Some did not yet exist. But across the low-lying basin where the main rivers wandered, the footprint of a disaster is clear. It did not cover the planet. It did not reach mountain tops. It did not wipe out every human being alive. Yet within the world the Sumerians knew, it was absolute. Every field, every village, every city that hugged the river valleys would have gone under brown water. From their vantage point, the flood really did sweep over everything. Once you see that muddy band in trench drawings and field reports, it becomes hard to dismiss the flood stories as pure invention. The King List treats the flood as a pivot that divides 2 ages. The dirt under Sumerian cities does the same. Yet the idea of a world-ending flood is not only a Mesopotamian obsession. The Hebrew book of Genesis tells a version in which a man named Noah is warned ahead of time, builds a vessel, brings his family and animals aboard, and rides out waters that cover the earth for months. When the land finally reappears, he begins again on a stripped and washed landscape. Older than Genesis is the Akkadian tale of Atrahasis. In that story, the gods grow annoyed at the noise of humanity and decide to wipe them out with a flood. One god, Enki, warns Atrahasis, tells him to build a boat, and urges him to bring his family and animals. He survives, frustrates the destructive plan, and stands on dry ground to begin a new chapter. Behind both of those versions is an even earlier Sumerian one. Fragments tell of Ziusudra, a king of Shuruppak, who is warned about a coming deluge, builds a vessel, and lives to repopulate the world. The geography in those stories points straight at the cities where archaeologists later found the thick flood layer. If this were where the pattern ended, it would be striking enough. A regional flood remembered in myth and confirmed in the dirt, it does not end there. In ancient Syria, texts from Ugarit describe a cosmic struggle in which the sea god threatens to cover the land. The details belong to a different theological world, filled with storm deities and heavenly councils, yet the background assumption is familiar. Water threatens to erase everything. In India, old Sanskrit texts speak of a great deluge called pralayas that periodically destroys the world at the end of cycles. In one story, a man named Manu is warned by a divine fish of an oncoming flood. He builds a boat and rides out the waters that swallow the earth. Afterward, he becomes the ancestor of a renewed humanity. Across the ocean in Mesoamerica, myths from both Aztec and Maya traditions describe previous worlds destroyed, some by flood. In one account, the sky rains for 52 years. Humans are turned into fish. Only a small number of survivors live to see the next age. These cultures did not share easy trade routes. They developed writing at different times. Their gods look and sound very different. Yet over and over, the same core pattern appears. A world that is old, a warning, a flood on a scale that feels total within that world, a vessel or a safe place, a survivor or a small group, a new start. Scholars have offered several explanations for this repetition. One is psychological. Floods are among the most frightening disasters humans experience. Water that rises without stopping, that sweeps away houses and fields, that makes familiar ground disappear, leaves deep marks on the mind. Every culture that lives near rivers or coasts will witness floods. It is natural that they would imagine a flood bigger than any they have seen, the flood, and wrap stories around it. Another explanation points to regional disasters. Mesopotamia had that massive inundation around 2900 BCE. The Indus Valley had periods of intense flooding. The Mediterranean has seen tsunamis from volcanic eruptions. Each region might have its own great flood memory, and over time these memories get exaggerated, ritualized, and turned into myths. There is a third possibility that reaches further back in time. At the end of the last ice age, between roughly 12,000 and 10,000 BCE, huge ice sheets melted. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters worldwide. Low-lying coasts that had been habitable for thousands of years were gradually drowned. If people had settled along those ancient shorelines, and there is growing evidence that they had, then their world would have changed dramatically in a few thousand years. Bays became gulfs, islands disappeared, coastal plains shrank, rivers carved new paths. To those living through it, the transformation might have felt like a drawn-out, relentless flood, not a single stormy night, a slow, inescapable rise that stole land a generation at a time. Human groups are good at telling stories. A striking event becomes a tale. That tale is told to children and grandchildren. Over centuries, details blur and shift, but the core bones remain. Once writing appears, those old stories finally have a material home. By then, different cultures have customized the tale to fit their landscapes and gods. The boat changes shape, the names change, the theology changes, the core remains stubborn. Water came, the old world ended, a few survived. Life restarted on higher, smaller ground. In that light, the Sumerian flood story might be doing double duty. On one level, it remembers a regional disaster that left a literal line of silt under Ur and Shuruppak. At the same time, it may be echoing a much older, deeper memory carried forward from a time when the oceans themselves were rising and swallowing entire coastlines. If that is even partly true, then when a Sumerian scribe pressed the word flood into clay, they may have been compressing into that simple sign the memory of more than one catastrophe, a local river surge that reset their cities, a global sea rise that reset human geography. Either way, the effect is similar. Continuity breaks. Old things vanish. Survivors look back and realize that they are living in the shadow of a world that no longer exists. The strongest pieces of that vanished world would not be its houses or walls. Those crumble fast. The most stubborn survivors would be ideas, practical knowledge, ways of measuring time, ways of tracking the sky, ways of organizing law, ways of working metal and mixing medicines. That kind of knowledge can cross disaster lines if someone cares enough to carry it. If you want to feel how much of that old world still lives inside your daily life, you do not need a museum. You just need a clock. Look at the face of time we use. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Those numbers are not natural in any obvious way. They are not based on 10 fingers. They are based on something else. A way of thinking that first shows up clearly on Sumerian clay. The Sumerians were not counting on a decimal system the way we do. Their math ran on a base 60 structure. It shows up from their earliest tablets. There is no phase where they experiment with base 8 or base 12 or some other approach, then gradually settle on 60. From the first documents we can read, 60 is already baked into their weights, measures, angles, and timekeeping. That choice is not random. 60 is a very friendly number for real-world calculations. It can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. If you are splitting grain, laying out fields, or dividing an angle in the sky, that flexibility makes life easier. It is the kind of number a practical mind falls in love with. Someone chose that structure long before any of us checked the time on a phone. In the scribal schools where Sumerian children trained to become the accountants and scholars of their day, they practiced this system relentlessly. Clay tablets from Nippur and other cities preserve multiplication tables that run deep into the thousands. There are sets of problems dealing with division and fractions, exercises in which students calculate compound interest on barley loans, and geometric puzzles about the area of awkward-shaped fields. The tablets often include a small standard phrase about the art they are teaching. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced, not recently invented, not something the current generation claims as its own. It is framed as a tradition handed down. One famous tablet, now in Yale, shows just how sharp that tradition could be. It is known by its catalogue number, YBC 7289. On its surface, a scribe has drawn a simple square and marked its diagonal. Next to that diagonal, in cuneiform numerals, is written a value that represents the square root of 2. Translated into modern decimal form, it comes out to 1.414213, correct to 6 decimal places. To reach that level of precision, you need a method. You need an algorithm, even if you do not call it that. You need to understand that there is such a thing as an irrational ratio that can be approximated closer and closer. Officially, those ideas arrived in Greece thousands of years later, yet here they are on a clay tablet from long before classical geometry. The same sense of quiet competence shows up in medicine. Some of the earliest medical tablets from Sumer do not read like confused first attempts at healing. They read more like pocket reference books. One tablet from Nippur lists a series of conditions and treatments: thyme and other herbs for breathing problems, preparations using willow bark to ease pain, mixtures of fermented grain for digestive complaints, ointments with cedar oil to clean wounds. Modern pharmacology has tested many of these ingredients and found active compounds inside them. Salicylic acid in willow bark is a good example. It is a relative of the main ingredient in aspirin. That does not mean every Sumerian remedy worked perfectly. It does mean that at least some of their prescriptions came from long observation. Someone had watched which plants helped and which plants harmed, and written down the results. You rarely get that kind of accuracy on the first try. It usually takes generations of trial and error. You would expect to find crude earlier recipes that are mostly superstition. There are surely many we have not recovered yet. Still, the oldest surviving medical texts already sit at a surprisingly advanced point on that learning curve. Metal tells a similar story. By around 3000 BCE, Sumerian smiths were producing bronze. That metal is an alloy of copper and tin. It only becomes truly useful when the ratio is right. Too much tin and your tools snap. Too little and the metal stays soft. The ideal balance is about 88% copper and 12% tin. The earliest bronze artifacts from Sumer already sit close to that optimal ratio. Their tools hold an edge, their weapons are not crumbly, their decorative pieces show sophisticated casting and hammering. Again, this suggests a long period of experimentation, somewhere in the background, where people tried different mixes and temperatures, kept what worked, and abandoned what did not. Very little of that fumbling stage is visible in recovered material. Law reveals the same pattern in a different language. When you read fragments of the earliest Sumerian legal codes, you do not find a simple list like hurt someone, then you are hurt in the same way. You find careful distinctions, clauses that separate deliberate harm from accidents, rules that set different penalties for injuries to different social classes, paths for appealing decisions, regulations around debt, interest, and the treatment of those who cannot pay. Legal systems like that usually grow out of actual disputes. Two neighbors fight over a field. A judge decides one way. The case sets a precedent. Over time, hundreds of arguments pile up, and someone finally writes them down as a unified set of rules. In Sumer, we see the written form, already nuanced, from very early on. The long, messy build-up that must have existed somewhere is hard to see in surviving tablets. Then there is the sky. The Sumerians and their cultural heirs paid close attention to the movements of planets and stars. Clay tablets, copied in Babylon, but based on older Sumerian records, track the position of Venus over a 21-year cycle. The entries are not mythic storytelling about a goddess in the heavens. They are dry notes. In this month, on this day, the star rose here. Later, it disappeared there. Modern astronomy has checked these patterns and found that the observations, once corrected for calendar drift, are accurate to within roughly a day. To build a record like that, you need a watching tradition that survives more than one human lifetime. Venus cycles do not repeat neatly year by year. You only start to see the pattern if you track them over long spans. The big temple towers that dominate some Sumerian cities are not just religious billboards. Many are aligned with careful attention to cardinal directions and to key solar positions. Some stairways face the sunrise on specific days. To set that up, builders had to understand where the sun rises at different times of year and how that changes over decades. Star lists from Mesopotamia record constellations that still feel familiar: a bull in the sky, a lion, a scorpion. These are not just poetic images, they mark locations used for timekeeping and agriculture. If you know when a particular constellation appears at dawn or dusk, you know when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect floods. There is also evidence that Mesopotamian astronomers noticed the repeating pattern of lunar eclipses that we now call the Saros cycle, roughly 18 years long. Recognizing that rhythm requires many decades of careful note-taking, with records kept safe enough that one generation of observers can compare their experiences with those of the previous one. Across all of this, from math to medicine, metalwork to law, astronomy to architecture, one theme keeps emerging. Sophisticated knowledge appears in written form without leaving a thick, accessible trail of written experiments behind it. From our perspective, that makes Sumer look like an out-of-place peak, a mountain of skill with little foothill rubble around it. From the Sumerians' own perspective, the picture may have looked completely different. For them, the peak belonged to a time already gone. They were the ones building in the ruins, using inherited maps. On their tablets, they keep saying that knowledge was given, that laws, measurements, and crafts were decrees from gods. Modern readers often treat this as modesty or piety. People in the ancient world like to give credit upward. It is also possible that given was the only word they had for inherited. Knowledge passed on from teachers whose names were forgotten. Techniques preserved without a clear memory of where those techniques originally came from. If some part of that inheritance reached them from a culture that existed before the flood layers in the ground, then the Sumerians may have been exactly what they said they were, not inventors of civilization, custodians of a toolkit salvaged from an earlier age. To understand just how strange this inheritance might be, you have to listen to the way the Sumerians spoke, not the sound of the language itself. That is long gone. What survives is the structure written into their tablets. Languages normally behave like living rivers. They flow, they branch, they merge, they leave behind old channels that can still be traced. Latin becomes Spanish, Italian, French, and Romanian. Spoken Latin in the streets of Rome gradually shifts until a few centuries later, a soldier from the empire would struggle to understand a farmer in France. Yet, linguists can track that change step by step. They compare spellings in old inscriptions, notes scribbled in the margins of manuscripts, and regional slang. Every stage leaves fossils. The same is true elsewhere. English grew from Old English, which came from earlier Germanic tongues, which have roots in a deep ancestor called Proto-Indo-European. That old ancestor is not written down anywhere. No one carved it into stone. Yet by comparing the similarities in its daughter languages, researchers can reconstruct a rough version of how it must have worked. Even writing systems show this kind of family tree. Chinese characters start as scratched pictures on bone and turtle shell. Over millennia, those same signs stretch, curl, and simplify into the forms used now. Egyptian hieroglyphs move from clear little pictures into highly stylized signs, and then birth simplified scripts that ordinary people could write faster. Some of those scripts eventually flow into the alphabet you are reading right now. Everywhere you look, languages and scripts belong to families. They have cousins and grandparents. Sumerian refuses to cooperate. When Sumerian appears in written form around 3300 BCE, it stands alone. Linguists call it an isolate. That is a tidy way of saying it has no known relatives, no sister languages, no parental branch, nothing. Its grammar is not like the Semitic languages that later dominate the region. Languages such as Akkadian, Assyrian, and later Babylonian are built around consonant roots. 3 consonants form a core meaning. Different vowels and patterns around those consonants change the meaning. KTB in Arabic, for example, can give you words related to writing. The same pattern shows up across Semitic tongues. Sumerian does not do this. Instead, it behaves more like a heavily agglutinative language. It builds complex meanings by stringing together small pieces. You start with a root word, then attach bits at the front and back, and sometimes in the middle. Each bit adds a function or shade of meaning. The word lugal means king. Add one ending, and you get lugal e, meaning by the king, an instrumental case. Add a different ending, and you get lugal ak of the king, a genitive case. Another ending turns it into lugal ra, to the king, a dative case. A single word can carry what English would need a whole phrase to express. This type of construction feels more like what you find in Turkish, Finnish, or Japanese than anything spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. Yet those languages today have clear relatives. They sit in families that linguists can trace. Sumerian does not slot cleanly into any group. Over the past century, researchers have tried to connect Sumerian to all sorts of candidates: Uralic languages from northern Eurasia, Dravidian tongues from southern India, isolated languages from the Caucasus, even the language of ancient Elam, a neighbor on the Iranian plateau. Every time, the deeper comparisons fall apart. At the level that matters most, core vocabulary and basic grammar, Sumerian remains stubbornly unique. The simplest conclusion is that Sumerian used to have relatives, but those other branches died out long ago, leaving no written record. Sumerian would then be the last surviving member of a lost language family. That answer sounds neat until you ask when those hypothetical relatives vanished and why there is no trace of them in known ancient cultures. The timing that makes the most sense for such a disappearance lines up a little too well with the flood layers in southern Mesopotamia. Written Sumerian appears around 3300 BCE, The big flood deposits under cities like Ur and Shuruppak date to around 2900 BCE. If Sumerian was already being spoken before that inundation, and if it was part of a broader language network among pre-flood communities, then many of its linguistic cousins would have been drowned, not just physically but culturally. Their speakers would have died or scattered, their words would have gone silent. The only branch that survived in written form would be Sumerian. The floodlines in the dirt would match a floodline in the family tree of language. There are hints inside Sumerian itself that it may not be as pure and isolated as it looks. Some features of its grammar behave oddly, as if they do not quite belong. Certain patterns feel like holdovers from an older system. Linguists call these traces a substrate, the ghost of an earlier language that influenced the one that replaced it. This kind of imprint appears when speakers of two languages mix. If a conquering group imposes its speech on a local population, the resulting blend often retains quirks from the older tongue. Word order may feel slightly off. Certain sounds may not follow expected rules. Grammatical structures that make no sense on their own may suddenly click if you imagine an earlier language pushing on them from underneath. If Sumerian carries a substrate, then at some point it grew on top of an even older tongue. We do not know what that tongue was called. We do not know where its speakers lived. Whatever it was, it left marks in the grammar of Sumerian and then vanished so completely that only those marks remain. There is another mystery wrapped around this language. Sumerian did not just appear and disappear. Even after Akkadian speakers became dominant in Mesopotamia, the old tongue refused to let go. By around 2500 BCE, Akkadian, a Semitic language, is clearly taking over as the language of daily life in many cities. People speak Akkadian in the streets, in the markets, in their homes, yet the schools continue teaching Sumerian. Temples continue using it in rituals and hymns. Royal inscriptions still lean on Sumerian phrases to sound ancient and authoritative. For more than 1,000 years, Sumerian and Akkadian coexist. One is the living language of conversation. The other becomes the language of scholarship, religion, and tradition. It is a situation that looks a lot like Latin in medieval Europe, long after ordinary people had moved on to French, Italian, or Spanish. By around 2000 BCE, Sumerian has died as a spoken language. No child grows up learning it at home, yet scribes keep copying Sumerian texts. They compile dictionaries that line up Sumerian words with Akkadian equivalents. They write grammar exercises to drill new generations of students. They maintain the old tongue because abandoning it would mean losing access to something they consider precious. In one tablet, a scribe writing in Akkadian adds a small note while copying a Sumerian hymn. The ancient words must not be altered. They contain the wisdom before the Great Change. No one explains what the Great Change was. It could refer to the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian culture. It could hint at the flood remembered in old stories. It could point to something even older, a line in time that had already faded into legend by the time that comment was written. Whatever the scribe meant, the attitude is clear. Sumerian is not just an old language. It is a key to texts, ideas, and memories that later people believe they cannot fully understand, but also cannot afford to lose. Even as empires rise and fall over Mesopotamia, Sumerian refuses to completely die. The very last known cuneiform tablet, written in the 1st century of our era, when the Roman Empire is already expanding, still contains Sumerian elements. At that point, the original speakers had been gone for more than 2,000 years, yet someone, somewhere, still thought it mattered enough to press those old signs into clay. If Sumerian is a fossil, it is a remarkably durable one, a shard of a much older world, preserved in a form that fire, flood, and empire could not easily erase. And if that fossil really does represent the last surviving branch of a language family that flourished before the known cities of Sumer, then the language itself becomes a kind of evidence. Proof not only that people lived before our current timelines admit, but that they were organized enough and complex enough to need a language like this. A language intricate enough to handle law, science, myth, and daily business. A language that appears in history already fully formed, carrying within it the faint pressure of voices that spoke long before anyone thought to set their words into clay. Most creation stories begin with perfection. A god speaks, and light appears. A cosmic egg cracks, and a complete world steps out. The divine mind imagines something, and reality simply complies. No drafts, no glitches, no awkward middle steps. Sumerian stories about our beginnings feel very different. They do not start with a perfect human strolling into a finished garden. They begin with tired gods who are sick of doing hard work. In one of the oldest surviving texts, the younger gods are the ones digging canals, dredging riverbeds, piling bricks, and keeping the machinery of the world running. After thousands of years of this, they have had enough. The story describes them throwing down their tools, marching on the assembly of the higher gods, and demanding relief. It sounds less like poetic myth, and more like workers walking off a job site. The senior gods gather to figure out what to do. They cannot go back to digging ditches themselves. They also cannot ignore the revolt. So one of them, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposes a solution: create a new kind of being to carry the burden. Let humans take on the heavy work. So far, this still sounds symbolic. Then the text begins to behave like a set of lab notes. The goddess in charge of birth is tasked with actually making these new workers. She does not snap her fingers and conjure a finished human. She gathers clay from the deep freshwater layer under the earth, the Apsu. She mixes that clay with the blood of a slain divine figure, whose life force is supposed to carry something crucial. The text uses a word that can mean intelligence, consciousness, understanding. It treats this essence like a transferable ingredient. Now the birth goddess and the wisdom god start experimenting. In one account, sometimes called Enki and Ninma, or Enki and Ninma, the goddess shapes a first human being, but the result is not ideal. This person cannot control their bodily functions. The story does not hide that. It describes the defect plainly. The wisdom god steps in and assigns this prototype a role where that limitation does not matter. Then another figure is created. This one has a problem with speech, the mouth never quite closing properly, the words never forming clearly. Again, instead of discarding the attempt, the wisdom god finds a niche. This being is given a function where song matters more than clear spoken language. A third creation has damaged eyesight. A fourth has weak hands. A fifth is infertile. Each time, the story lists the problem and then the adjustment. The wisdom god looks at the flaw and chooses a job that fits what is possible. It goes on like that through several attempts. If you strip away the divine names and just listen to the structure, what you hear is not instant perfection. It is trial and error, prototype, defect, adaptation, repeat. Eventually, the text describes a more stable outcome. The process is refined. A group of birth goddesses is involved. They produce multiple males and multiple females, enough to form a breeding population rather than one symbolic pair. The new humans can work, reproduce, and maintain the tasks the gods want to hand off. The language in these passages is surprisingly procedural. It talks about mixing, shaping, forming, placing. It describes ingredients and roles. It reads less like a mystical chant and more like a narrative wrapped around some remembered process. Later traditions took very different approaches. In the Hebrew book of Genesis, humans are formed from dust and animated by a breath in a single step. In Greek myths, Prometheus shapes humans from earth and gives them fire without a long list of failed bodies first. Egyptian stories show craftsman gods moulding humans on a potter's wheel, each one turning out just right. Only in the Sumerian material do you see this run of flawed versions and adjustments, physical impairments, cognitive issues, reproductive problems, all treated with a strange mixture of compassion and practicality. Every being finds a place. Every defect is paired with a function. Scholars who read these texts in the modern era often interpret them as social commentary. They see the catalogue of disabilities as a way for ancient writers to say that people with limitations still have value and roles in the community. That reading is generous and not wrong. The texts certainly acknowledge that those who are not physically perfect can still contribute. Yet the step-by-step structure is hard to ignore. The sequence of attempt, failure, modification looks very much like someone trying to record stages in a process rather than simply making a moral point. If you imagine a world without genetics, without lab vocabulary, without diagrams or formulas, but with careful observers watching how life changes when you deliberately pair certain traits, how would you preserve what you had learned? How would you talk about attempts that did not work and improvements that finally did? You would need a story. You would need characters who can stand in for forces you cannot name. Instead of saying a certain mixture of elements produced a non-viable organism, you might say a goddess mixed clay and essence, and the being that resulted could not see, or could not bear children, or could not control its limbs. Instead of describing selective breeding in technical terms, you might talk about birth goddesses creating many humans at once under guidance, adjusting methods until the result can carry out specific work. In that sense, the creation myths become containers. They hold patterns that could be older than the writing itself. Memories of a time when someone, somewhere, watched life and tinkered with it, then tried to hand that knowledge down in a form that could survive without microscopes or textbooks. The Sumerian stories never say humans emerged by accident. They also do not claim people appeared as finished products in a single instant. They present humanity as the outcome of deliberate crafting, shaped with intent, refined through multiple cycles, made to perform certain jobs on Earth. From our perspective, that is deeply uncomfortable territory. It brushes up against questions about where consciousness comes from and whether anyone has ever engineered life. Modern culture tends to slam the door on that line of thought by labeling these stories pure myth and moving on. The text itself sits there on clay and quietly refuses to simplify. It describes mixing physical matter with a non-physical ingredient. It describes a process that takes time and involves mistakes. It describes a collaboration between different kinds of beings with different roles. Maybe that is just imagination. Or maybe it is something else. A way of translating observations and traditions from a much older world into a language an ancient audience could understand. A kind of coded testimony. If that sounds far-fetched, it is worth remembering that people in Sumer knew what it was to work with bloodlines in a very practical way. They bred animals, they selected plants, they had a direct, hands-on experience of how life changes when you control who mates with whom. If someone in a pre-flood culture took that intuitive practice and pushed it further, turning it toward a more systematic manipulation of life, anyone trying to tell that story later would need to convert a process with no words into a series of images and actions. Gods mixing clay and essence and trying again until they get it right is a powerful way to do that. However far you are willing to follow that thought, The Sumerian creation accounts remain startling because they are so honest about error and revision. In a world where many traditions prefer to open with instant perfection, they quietly insist that even at the level of gods, getting humans right took work. When Sumerian texts talk about who handed them their tools and laws and measurements, they use a specific word. They say these gifts came from the Anunnaki. On old cylinder seals, the Anunnaki are shown as a line of seated figures on thrones. They wear horned crowns. They hold symbols of rank. They sit in council like a group of elders at a serious meeting. Above or beside them, a short line of cuneiform identifies them as the great gods who decide destiny. They appear everywhere in the literature, in hymns, in legal formulas, in creation texts, in lists of offerings. They are not vague cosmic forces in the background. They have names, relationships, rivalries, favorite cities. They are described as ruling from the sky and also as walking on earth, living in specific temples that need food offerings and regular cleaning. The word Anunnaki can be broken apart. Anu is the sky god, the high figure at the top of the pantheon. Naki can be read as offspring. The Anunnaki are literally children of the sky god, the group responsible for carrying out the work of running the world. They are in charge of specific departments. Enki is linked with fresh water, wisdom, crafts, and the deep places. He is credited with teaching people irrigation, mathematics, and writing. Enlil is associated with air, storms, and agriculture. He is the one who decides when crops flourish and when they fail. Inanna is tied to love, war, and the bright movements of Venus across the sky. Utu is linked to the sun and to justice. Ninhursag is responsible for birth and the fertility of land and living things. These are not gentle abstract ideas. They are practical portfolios. When a tablet says Enki placed in order the decrees and spread the pickaxe and the basket, it is not talking in vague poetic code. It is saying someone taught people how to dig, how to carry, how to build. Another line praises Enlil for bringing forth the seed of the land and organizing ploughing and sowing. That is not mystical decoration. It is a claim that knowledge of agriculture, of how to time planting and manage herds, came through instruction. What makes the Anunnaki so strange is how human they are. They have power beyond ordinary people. They live far longer. They can travel between heaven and earth. Yet they are not all knowing or unchanging. The texts show them making mistakes, arguing, changing their minds. They tire of hard work. They regret deciding to flood the world. They gather in councils to vote on what to do next. They can be petty, jealous, loyal, loving, cruel, generous. They are portrayed as rulers who share the same emotional range as the people writing about them. That blend of power and limitation has led some scholars to offer a provocative idea. Maybe the Anunnaki were not invented from nothing as sky gods. Maybe they began as real leaders in a distant time, a group of pre-flood figures who preserved knowledge, organized peoples, and later were remembered as more than human. Across cultures, it is common for important ancestors to be raised to divine status. Roman emperors were declared gods after death. Egyptian pharaohs were treated as embodiments of gods while alive. In China, imperial ancestors are still honored at altars as powerful spirits who can influence the living. If a group of influential individuals guided a shattered population after a catastrophe, if they preserved advanced skills and shared them, it would not take long for their memory to rise into legend. A few generations later, those culture heroes would be described as something more than human. 1,000 years later, they would be gods. Sumerian religion fits this pattern in several ways. The Anunnaki do not stand outside creation. They live in houses with addresses. They eat offerings brought to them. They have children with humans in some tales, producing mixed bloodlines that later kings claim as their own. The Sumerian king list even names certain rulers as born of divine parentage and a human mother. This blending of mortal and divine runs through many genealogies. It is either a way of making royal families sound impressive or a reflection of a belief that some families really did descend from an older, more powerful group. What makes this idea more intriguing is how similar figures show up in places that should not share stories easily. In ancient Egypt, sacred texts mention beings called Netjeru, often translated as gods. In early layers of tradition, many Netjeru are described as arriving during a very ancient time to bring order to the land. They are credited with teaching, writing, agriculture, and the right timing for rituals. In India, Vedic and later writings describe devas, bright beings who uphold cosmic law, teach humanity sacred knowledge, and sometimes step into human affairs in times of crisis. They are not pure symbols. They have personalities, rivalries, and favorite regions. In Central and South America, cultures speak of sky-linked teachers. Among the Maya and the Aztecs, the feathered serpent figure brings writing, calendar knowledge, agriculture, and social rules. Among the Inca, a figure called Viracocha emerges after a time of chaos, teaches people how to live, then disappears. Greek myth tells of titans, older beings who ruled before the Olympian gods. One of them, Prometheus, is said to have given humans fire and skills, and then is punished for bringing knowledge down to earth. Early Jewish texts talk about watchers, a group of heavenly beings who descend, interact with humans, and share knowledge of metalwork, cosmetics, astrology, and warfare. They are described as crossing a line they were not supposed to cross. Each of these traditions is wrapped in its own symbolism. They do not share a single copied story, yet the pattern repeats enough times to make you pause. There is always a group that comes from above or from outside. They carry knowledge ordinary humans do not have. They teach that knowledge in a period of rebuilding or change. They often cross boundaries between their realm and ours. They eventually leave, are removed, or step back, and their memory hardens into divine status. The usual explanation is that humans everywhere like the idea that wisdom comes down from the sky. It feels natural to imagine knowledge as a gift from beyond. According to that view, different cultures independently made up similar teacher beings. Another option is cultural borrowing. Supposedly, one culture came up with the teacher god pattern, and through trade and conquest, other cultures picked it up and adapted it. In some regions that clearly happened. Stories about flood survivors and sky beings moved along caravan routes and sea lanes. Yet some of these teacher figures appear in places that had limited contact for long stretches of time. The details vary, but the core roles line up with a stubborn clarity. Teachers arrive. They bring structured knowledge in farming, building, law, and timekeeping. They leave. They are remembered as more than human. If you set aside the later religious layers for a moment and read these figures simply as placeholders, it becomes possible to see them as reflections of something real. Not winged spirits, but people or groups who held fragments of a lost toolkit and carried it across a disaster line. The Sumerians gave that role to the Anunnaki. For them, these were the ones who carried decrees from the sky, established the pattern of cities, weights, measures, and rituals. When Sumerian kings wanted to legitimize their rule, they claimed authority from these beings. When scribes wanted to explain complex crafts, they named the Anunnaki as first teachers. In that light, the Anunnaki are not just gods in the modern sense. They become witnesses. Their names stand in for unknown predecessors, a way of saying we did not build this staircase from scratch. Someone else showed us how. Across the world, other cultures seem to be doing the same thing with different names, dressing the memory of early teachers in divine clothing so that their influence can be honored and carried across generations that forgot the specific human faces behind the stories. If that is even partly true, then Sumerian religion holds a kind of encoded testimony. It is not simply a fantasy system of invented gods. It is an archive for the memory of those who helped rebuild after something broke the line of history. Imagine holding a thread between your fingers. On one end of that thread sit the Anunnaki, the teacher beings the Sumerians named in their hymns and legal formulas. On the other end sit questions we still argue about today. Where did civilization really start? How much did catastrophe erase? What is memory and what is myth? To see where that thread pulls, you have to lay all the pieces side by side and look at them without flinching. Start with the shape of Sumer itself. In the archaeological record, there is no visible staircase of small, clumsy attempts that gradually turn into mature cities. Uruk arrives already wide and crowded behind long walls. Eridu holds temples that look like blueprints rather than experiments. Lagash manages irrigation systems that behave like the work of seasoned engineers, not first-time canal diggers. From the very earliest levels where the culture is clearly Sumerian, everything looks strangely finished. Writing follows the same pattern. The first fully readable cuneiform tablets are already capable of carrying poetry, contracts, math tables, star charts, and medical prescriptions. There is no long paper trail of proto-writing filled with confused marks and abandoned sign systems. Cuneiform appears polished, not perfect, but far more refined than you would expect from the opening chapter of literacy. Law fits. The oldest Sumerian codes that survive are not primitive lists of punishments. They already distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. They already account for social class, property, inheritance, and contracts. They look like the product of many disputes that have been worked through and resolved, then distilled into general rules. Math fits. From the earliest school tablets, the sexagesimal system is already fixed. 60 as a base shows up in time, angles, and measurement. Multiplication tables, division problems, and geometric exercises do not build toward that system. They assume it. Science fits. Star lists, eclipse records, and planet observations appear with a level of continuity that implies long habits of watching the sky. The ziggurats align with cardinal directions and solar points with a precision that suggests careful observation over many years. Medicine and metallurgy fit. The earliest surviving recipes and metal artifacts look like the refined end of many experiments, not the awkward start. Then you have the flood layers, bands of clean clay under cities like Kish, and Shurapak. Human life, mud laid down by rushing water, human life again. The king list treats the flood as a dividing line that separates two different ways of counting time. One based on vast cycles, one based on more human-scale reigns. Sumerian language itself behaves like a survivor. It appears in writing without known relatives. It carries hints of a substrate from an older tongue. It refuses to fit neatly into any recognized family. For a while it coexists with Akkadian. Then it dies as a spoken language, yet survives in schools and temples because later cultures believe it holds ancient wisdom. Even when no one speaks it at home, scribes keep copying Sumerian texts as if they are preserving something irreplaceable. Thread through all of this are the myths. Stories of humans made from clay, mixed with a special essence. Stories of multiple attempts, failed bodies, adjusted roles, and eventual success. stories of gods who teach people how to farm, how to write, how to build canals, how to watch the skies, and again a phrase appears. Restoration of what was before. Not invention, not discovery. Restoration. The Sumerians themselves do not claim to be pioneers. They claim to be caretakers of something older. You could look at each of these observations separately and shrug them off. Civilizations sometimes look like they appear quickly when you are missing data. Flood stories can arise wherever rivers threaten. Isolate languages exist. Myths are just how humans decorate the unknown. Temples everywhere like to talk about their designs coming from distant days because it makes them sound venerable. All of that is reasonable. It is when you see the same pattern repeating across different domains that the ground starts to feel less solid. Mature systems without obvious developmental debris, a physical catastrophe that lines up with a literary pivot, a language that behaves like the last branch of a dead family tree, myths that describe procedure instead of instantaneous magic, religious texts that insist on restoration instead of originality. Now add the global echoes. Flood stories show up in regions that did not share easy communication with Mesopotamia. Teacher figures descend from the sky or arrive from over the sea in traditions as far apart as Egypt, India, the Americas, and the Pacific. They bring the same things: agriculture, writing, timekeeping, law. They live among humans for a time, then disappear or are removed. Their memory rises into the level of gods. You do not have to assume some single grand conspiracy to notice that the structure of these stories is consistent. There is an old world that ends, usually by water or fire. A small number of survivors carry forward fragments. Teachers help them rebuild. Later generations remember those teachers as beings from a higher realm who gave them what they could not have produced alone. From the point of view of someone living in a rebuilt world with little sense of how many ages have passed, that memory would feel like a story from another layer of reality. Now imagine standing in a Sumerian scribal school. The air is hot. The room smells like damp clay. Children copy old texts line by line. Some of those texts praise the Anunnaki as bringers of civilization. Some tell stories of how humans were made. Some list kings from before the flood in blocks of time measured in strange cycles. Those children are not living in the world those stories describe. They stand in its shadow. Their grand teachers may not fully understand the origin of every line they recite. They do know one thing. They have been told not to change the words. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. For them, that distant time is not a fantasy. It is a broken line they can feel, but not see clearly. The myths, the king lists, the ritual phrases, and the old language itself have become the last threads connecting them to a past that did not survive intact. You and I, standing much farther down the timeline, looking back through broken tablets and translation tables, are trying to work out what those threads were tied to at the other end. Maybe they only reach as far as the earliest cities in the plain. Maybe they reach past the flood silt into a forgotten layer of human history. Maybe they reach back to communities that lived on coastlines now drowned by post-Ice Age seas. What matters for the story is that the Sumerians did not see themselves as the starting point. They saw themselves as people who had inherited a dangerous responsibility to keep certain forms of knowledge alive, to maintain patterns they believed had been handed down, to guard texts they did not fully understand because those texts came from before the Great Change. If you listen closely, their writing does not sound like the confident voice of a civilization announcing itself. It sounds like the careful voice of an archivist who knows how easy it is for memory to die. There is a question sitting quietly behind everything we have walked through. What if what we call myth is sometimes just memory wearing a costume? When modern people hear the word myth, we tend to file it in the same drawer as fairy tales. Fun, symbolic, maybe revealing something about the human mind, but not about events that actually happened. We treat myth as fiction the ancient world told itself to explain thunder, or seasons, or why people fall in love. The trouble is that Sumerian material keeps smuggling real information into those stories. When you read the flood narratives, you are not just reading about a boat and a storm. You are hearing the echo of a geological event, still visible as a layer of mud under multiple cities. When you read the king list, with its impossible reigns, you are not just listening to bragging. You are seeing a numerical pattern based on their actual system of measuring large spans of time. When you read the creation texts, you are not just listening to drama between gods. You are watching a sequence that looks like a series of prototypes, defects, and adjustments. A process story wrapped in divine imagery. In the background of all of this, there are the hard numbers that do not care what anyone believes. The square root of 2 scratched into clay to 6 decimal places. The carefully observed cycles of Venus and eclipses. The base 60 structure baked into time and angle. The medical recipes that still work. It gets harder to say this is all fantasy once you notice how well these people could handle reality. If you imagine someone in the ancient world sitting under a tree and simply inventing a cosmology, you would expect wild guesses. You would expect star positions that do not match the sky and medicines that rarely help. You would expect numbers that are symbolic but not accurate. Sumer does not look like that. It looks like a place where observation was taken seriously, where someone watched the heavens every night and recorded what they saw, where someone tried different plant mixtures for generations and kept the ones that eased pain, where someone cut and fitted stone and brick and learned which shapes hold and which collapse. So when that same culture tells you that its knowledge came as a restoration, not as a first discovery, it is worth at least considering that they might not have been speaking metaphor all the time. There is another habit we have that can blind us. We often assume that people in the deep past were less intelligent than we are, less capable of careful thought, less able to keep complex ideas straight. We see stone tools and mud brick houses and think childlike. Intelligence is not an invention of the modern age. A person who lived 6,000 years ago had the same basic brain structure you have, the same potential for pattern recognition, curiosity, creativity. What they lacked was technology in the way we think of it today. They did not lack the ability to remember and pass down stories that mattered. If you gave a Sumerian scribe the tools of a modern lab, they would learn to use them. If you dropped a modern person into a Sumerian field with nothing but their hands, they would need a Sumerian farmer to show them how not to starve. What changes over time is not raw intelligence, it is continuity. It is how much information a culture can carry forward without losing it. That is why the flood matters so much in this story. Whether you see it as a regional catastrophe or as a local echo of a global sea rise, its main effect is the same. It breaks continuity. It interrupts the slow handoff of knowledge from one generation to the next. When that happens, the survivors are left holding fragments. They might know how to do certain things very well and have no idea where those techniques came from. They might remember that there was a time when more was known. They might not be able to say exactly what that more was. If those survivors are careful, they will turn their fragments into rituals, into laws, into stories, into languages that they refuse to let die. They will bury foundation cones under temples, carve phrases into stone, and bake tablets in the heat of fires that were meant to destroy them. They will also, inevitably, turn human teachers into gods. Think about what it would feel like to stand in a world that has just staggered back from a near wipeout. Food is scarce, land has changed, the old centers are gone. Small groups of people are trying to rebuild from whatever scraps they have. Then another group appears. They know when to plant. They know how to lay out a canal. They know how to keep time by the sky. They show you how to build in brick instead of rough stone. They bring weights and measures. They settle disputes in a way that actually keeps the peace. You would not see them as ordinary strangers. You would see them as coming from a higher place, whether that place was a literal mountain, a distant land, or just a level of understanding that you no longer had. Their children would marry into your families. Their names would enter your stories. Their faces would blur over time. The skills they passed on would become part of your daily life. Their memory would rise into that bright place we call myth, high enough that you tip your head back to look at it. This is not about spacesuits or conspiracy boards covered in red string. It is about how humans honor those they think saved them. It is about how memory stretches what it loves until it fills the sky. The Sumerians were very clear about one thing. They believed that something precious had been given to them from distant days. They believed that the structures of their society were not random, they were decrees. They were patterns laid down first in a time before the flood and then handed back to them. They built their cities and their laws inside those patterns. They wrote in their old language even after it fell out of use, because they believed that language carried those patterns better than any new tongue could. They invoked the names of teacher beings when they explained where their crafts came from. From where we stand, it is easy to flatten all of that into a category called myth and move on. If we do that, we risk missing what the clay is trying to tell us. Because the clay is stubborn, it will not burn, it will not rot, it will not politely dissolve. It sits through empire and war and sandstorms. It sits in the dark of museum drawers. It sits in crates that no one has unpacked yet. It waits. On some of those tablets, if you lean close enough in the gallery, you can see the maker's fingerprints. Those ridges belong to someone who lived before pyramids dotted the Egyptian desert, before philosophers argued in Greek courtyards, before Rome was even a rumour. That person pressed their thumb into wet clay while recording something they believed mattered enough to outlive them. They did not think of themselves as mythical. They did not think of themselves as ancient. To them, life was happening right now. The flood was within reach of memory. The teachers were 1 or 2 stories away. The weight of what they had been told to preserve was heavy on their shoulders. We are the ones who call them ancient and their stories mythology. From their side, they were simply doing what had to be done so that someone down the line would still know a fraction of what had once been common knowledge. If that is true, then every wedge-shaped mark on those tablets is not just a symbol, it is a decision. It is someone choosing to push back against forgetting, to fix something in clay so that it would still be there when the next wave of disaster rolled over the world. There is a way of looking at history that most of us grow up with without even knowing it. It goes like this. In the beginning, humans live in small scattered bands. They hunt, they gather. Slowly they learn to plant seeds. Villages appear. Villages become towns. Towns become cities. Writing is invented. Law is invented. Astronomy is invented. Civilization rises. The whole story climbs in a neat upward slope that leads directly to us. It feels nice. It feels organized. It puts us at the cutting edge of the story, standing on a mountain of progress with the past stretched out behind us in tidy steps. Sumer refuses to fit into that shape. When you put the pieces we have talked about on a table and look at them together, a different picture starts to glow through. Instead of a slow climb, you see a sharp drop and a partial recovery. You see a world that behaves as if someone already knew how to do advanced things. Then you see something hit that world hard enough to break continuity. Then you see survivors slowly standing up in the ruins, picking through fragments, and trying to use what they can remember. The flood stories are the most obvious part of that picture. They say it directly. There was a world before. It ended in water. A few people lived. They began again. The dirt backs that up with those thick bands of silt beneath cities in southern Mesopotamia. Archaeology shows human life, then sudden clean mud, then human life again. The king list sits next to that trench and calmly divides time into a before and an after, separated by a single line about waters sweeping over. The language behaves like a survivor too. Sumerian arrives in writing without relatives and hangs on long after it dies as a spoken tongue because later cultures are convinced it carries something worth preserving. That is how people treat the last copy of a book they know they cannot replace. The myths talk about humans being fashioned through trial and error for specific work. They talk about teacher beings who bring the tools of civilization. They talk about restoring older designs, not inventing new ones. They repeat the phrase restoration of what was before until it becomes almost a refrain. The practical texts show evidence of someone somewhere actually knowing those tools well. Accurate star cycles, elegant mathematics, applied medicine, effective metalwork, nuanced law. You can look at all of that and still hold on to the idea that Sumer was just an early lucky jump, a natural result of many small innovations that left only a thin trail in the ground. That is the safe version, the one that lets the familiar timeline survive. There is another way to read the same evidence. In that version, Sumer is not a beginning. It is a salvage operation. The scribes in Nippur and Uruk are not inventing civilization. They are rebuilding it with whatever pieces they can pull out of the mud. The Anunnaki in their stories are not imaginary sky people. They are the remembered face of those who helped survivors relearn how to live in something like the old way. The king list is not a list of kings who really lived for 30,000 years. It is a damaged copy of an older calendar that measured eras in large cycles. The pre-flood reigns are not lifetimes. They are labels for slices of time in a system nobody fully understands anymore. The post-flood part of the list is where people start using normal reign lengths again, because that is all they can relate to. The creation myths are not meant to be scientific textbooks. They are mythic wrappers around fragments of hard-won knowledge about life and heredity that bled through from an earlier culture that did more with that understanding than simply breed better goats. The flood tales are not just moral stories about anger and forgiveness. They are memory maps pointing at real disaster layers under real cities and, perhaps, at older sea rises that swallowed whole coastlines now invisible beneath shallow oceans. In that frame, the Sumerians look less like a people standing proudly at the dawn of history, and more like a people kneeling in its ruins, trying to save what they can. That way of seeing things is uncomfortable because it flips our position in the story. Instead of standing at the beginning of a long climb, we might be standing near the quiet end of a longer cycle. Instead of being the first culture to reach a certain level of complexity, we might be one of several that tried, with gaps of forgetting in between. If that is true, then the question is no longer whether there was a pre-flood civilization. The question becomes how much of it survived, and how much has already been lost beyond recovery. Look at the patterns again with that in mind. A writing system that appears mature in its earliest form. That is what you would expect from people who are putting into writing practices that existed in spoken form in an older world and have suddenly become fragile. They do not have time to stumble through doodles. They need a script that can carry law, trade, and ritual right away. A legal code that is nuanced from the start. That is what you would expect if disputes and their solutions had been worked out in an earlier age and then carried forward in remembered rulings until someone finally etched them into clay. An advanced base 60 math system. That is what you would expect If people in a drowned culture had discovered how useful that structure was for trade, building, and astronomy, then taught it to their children as a standard way of counting that later scribes took for granted. A language isolate. That is what you would expect if most of the other branches of its family tree had gone underwater or vanished in regions that never adopted writing. The last branch survives only because it happened to be spoken in a place where clay was abundant, and someone decided to use that clay as a memory device. Teacher gods whose portfolios line up across cultures. That is what you would expect if scattered survivor groups around the world had been helped by people who carried fragments of a shared toolkit. Each local culture remembered those helpers in its own style. Over time, those memories turned into divine genealogies. None of this can be proven the way we prove a simple chemical reaction. We are dealing with broken texts, missing layers, and interpretations that lean on patterns rather than photographs. But history is often built from exactly that. Patterns in potsherds, patterns in bones, patterns in the words people use when they are trying to talk about something too large for their own lives. The Sumerians felt close enough to a world-changing event that they told stories about it as if someone's grandfather still remembered the water. They treated certain knowledge as sacred, not because they did not understand it, but because they felt like they were holding the last copy. And here is where the thread suddenly runs right into us. Because whether or not you believe in a forgotten pre-flood culture, we are now the ones living with knowledge that could be lost. We are the ones who can erase centuries of understanding that sit on servers and screens if we are careless. When you scroll past a photograph of a clay tablet, you are looking at a technology of memory that survived fire, flood, and conquest. Those little wedge shapes have outlived kings, nations, and languages. They have outlived the hands that made them by 6,000 years. If the people who pressed those wedges believed they were writing down fragments of a much older story, then their stubborn work has carried that story to you. They did their part. The question that hangs in the air now is simple. What do we do with it? Think about how much of the planet we actually see. Most of human history is not laid out in textbooks. It is buried under cities and farmland. It is dissolved in river, mud, and seabed. Archaeologists like to say that what we know comes from a tiny fraction of what once existed. Less than a fraction of a % of ancient sites have been touched with a trowel. Even at famous places, only small strips have been carefully dug. The rest of the story sits in darkness. Every time a new site is uncovered, our picture of the past shifts a little. Sometimes it shifts a lot. A temple turns out to be older than expected. A settlement appears in a place no one thought people were living that early. A new set of inscriptions connects cultures we thought were separate. Our timeline wobbles, then settles again in a slightly new shape. Now add oceans. During the last ice age, the level of the seas was far lower than it is today. That means coastlines did not sit where they sit now. River mouths stretched further out. Wide plains, now hidden beneath shallow water, were then dry land. If people liked living near coasts and river deltas, which they still do, many of their villages and early towns would have been built in places that waves now roll over every day. We have only begun to look seriously at those drowned edges. Sonar scans and underwater surveys are starting to reveal the ghost outlines of old riverbeds and terraces. Divers sometimes find worked stone and tools under the waves. These hints do not prove that there was a global high-technology society waiting down there. They do show that the land where many early communities lived is currently out of easy reach. When you remember that, the Sumerian problem looks a little different. We see Sumer because they wrote on clay in a region that later stayed mostly above water. Their tablets survived like dishes in a collapsed kitchen while the wooden shelves and roof burned away. We see the flood layer under Ur because that site happened to be excavated deeply at the right spot. We hear Sumerian myths because scribes copied them over and over until some copies landed in museum basements instead of turning back into dust. If you imagine another culture that lived mostly along coasts, which are now drowned, and that wrote on material less durable than baked clay, very little of that culture would be accessible to us without serious underwater archaeology. What we would get on land are the faint echoes that later people carried inland: stories, a few symbols, a math system, oddly advanced tricks in stone. That is exactly what Sumer looks like from one angle, a catchment basin for older ideas. This does not mean there was a movie version Lost Civilization with shining towers and machines humming under crystal skies. Reality tends to be more mixed. Farms and mud and sweat and arguments, with pockets of brilliance where someone solves a problem in a way that lasts. What it does mean is that our default assumption that complexity only rises once may be too simple. There is a reason historians and archaeologists are cautious. Their job is to draw conclusions from actual material evidence, from bones, from pottery, from layers in the earth. When someone suggests that there might have been a forgotten chapter in the story, the first question has to be, where is the proof? That is how you keep imagination from outrunning reality. At the same time, absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence, especially when you know most of the relevant ground has not been examined. The lack of a smoking gun does not prove that something never existed. It only proves that we have not found it yet, or that it decayed in forms we do not recognize. The Sumerians, for their part, never claimed to have found everything. They talk constantly about distant days rather than original days. They talk about restoring plans rather than inventing them. They talk about knowledge being given without spelling out who held it before. That cultural humility is striking. It invites a different stance from us. Instead of looking back with a sense of superiority, as if we are the first ones to figure out how to be clever, we can look back with a sense of kinship and caution. Kinship, because those people were as intelligent as we are, and cautious, because their own story hints that even highly capable cultures can be knocked down so hard that later generations forget how high they once climbed. Try a thought experiment. Imagine our world from the viewpoint of someone digging 6,000 years from now. Most of our records sit on servers, in clouds, on fragile drives. Our buildings are made of steel and concrete that will crumble if left unmaintained. Our cities are mostly on coasts and river mouths that may not look anything like they do now. If a series of disasters struck, and then time did what time always does, how much would be left? Maybe a few dams, some deep foundations, fragments of satellites in far orbits, bits of plastic fused into future rock, a handful of buildings that happen to be buried quickly. Those future archaeologists would piece together what they could. They might find a rusted car and think it was a ceremonial object. They might stumble on an underground server farm full of dead drives and have no way to read them. If they then found a single archive from a few centuries after some great collapse, written in a language they could decode, they would treat that archive with reverence. Even if the people in those texts did not fully understand everything the previous age had been capable of, even if they wrapped the memories in myth, those stories would be precious. They would be the closest thing to a voice from before. We may be standing in exactly that position relative to Sumer. Looking at their tablets is like finding one small dry shelf in a library that mostly burned down. The texts are singed, some are missing pages, the catalogue numbers are in a language we barely understand. Yet, on those shelves, you keep finding sentences that describe fires, that list books that used to exist, that mention teachers who once walked those halls. When you read a Sumerian hymn or a king list or a creation story with that image in mind, the tone changes. it stops sounding like a primitive attempt at science. It starts sounding like the work of people who know they are standing in debris and are trying to write labels on anything that might still be useful. This is not about turning every myth into a literal report. It is about taking seriously the possibility that some myths are built on top of real events and real techniques. It is about listening when a culture as observant and skilled as Sumer says, again and again, that they are restoring something. It also reflects a larger pattern in how human memory works. We are good at keeping stories alive through repetition. We are less good at keeping explanations alive. Over time, people remember that something important happened, that someone did something impressive, that a pattern exists. The details of how and why fade first. What remains is the outline in narrative form. When those outlines finally get written down, they can look like fantasy, because the practical context that made them ordinary is gone. A description of someone watching the sky every night and predicting eclipses turns into a story about a god who can call darkness over the sun. A description of a group that knows how to lay out canals becomes a tale of beings who control water. The Sumerians might have been closer to those origins than we are, but even for them, explanation may have already been dissolving at the edges. They captured what they could in the only containers they had: clay, ritual, song, and a language that was already beginning to retreat into the realm of the sacred. So where does that leave us? With a choice, really. We can keep treating their tablets as curiosities, little windows into a very early stage of a one-way ladder that leads to us, or we can let them challenge our sense of being the first and only peak. We can let the idea sink in that history might not be a straight line climbing from darkness into light. It might be a series of waves, rising, breaking, receding, rising again, each wave carrying forward some of what the last one built and losing other parts that sink into the depths for good. If that picture is closer to the truth, then the most important thing we can learn from the Sumerians is not a specific fact about kings or gods. It is how they treated memory. Picture a room, not a temple, not a palace, just a storage room in a museum. The lights are off most of the time. The air is cool and dry. Metal shelves stand in long rows. On those shelves sit box after box, each one filled with fragments of clay that used to be part of something whole. In one box, a broken tablet carries a faint list of barley rations. In another, a fragment preserves a single line of a hymn. In another, all you can see is half of a number from a lost calculation. To most people, it would look like trash. To the person who understands what they are looking at, it is the remains of a mind. Every one of those pieces started the same way. Someone pressed their fingers into wet clay and decided that a certain set of words or numbers mattered enough to fix in a form that fire and flood would have trouble erasing. That act is the quiet heart of everything we have been circling. The Sumerians could not control the rivers completely. They could not stop droughts, or invasions, or earthquakes. They could, however, try to control what stayed remembered. They did that with clay and a stylus. We do it with files, signals, and screens. The tools changed. The instinct did not. When you stand in front of those old tablets, you are not just looking at information. You are looking at a choice made by someone who lived 6,000 years ago. The choice to push back against the erasing power of time for as long as they could. They believed that what they had inherited was worth that effort. They believed that the story of how kingship descended, of how cities were planned, of how stars moved, of how laws worked, of how humans were shaped, was not just interesting, it was essential. They also believed that story was not theirs alone. That is one of the most striking things about Sumer. For all their pride in their own cities and kings, for all the ways they celebrated their victories, their oldest texts keep pointing away from themselves. toward distant days, toward plans they did not draw up, toward teachers whose names grew larger than life. They wrote about the restoration of what was before because they felt they were part of a chain, not its first link. We live in a time that does not always think that way. It is easy to imagine that everything started with the latest device, the latest platform, the latest idea that went viral last week. It is easy to forget that there were ages of trial, error, discovery, and loss behind every number on a clock and every word on a page. The tablets sitting in museum rooms are an antidote to that amnesia. They remind us that people far removed from us in time were already wrestling with questions about origin, memory, and meaning. They remind us that those people were capable of both rigorous observation and wild storytelling, often on the same piece of clay. They remind us that even a highly organized culture can live in the shadow of something it only half remembers. There is a second reminder tucked into those wedge marks too. Nobody in Sumer sat down and wrote, "Today I will preserve the true origin story of humanity." They wrote ration lists because workers needed to eat. They wrote contracts because people argued about land. They wrote hymns because festivals needed songs. They wrote myths because communities needed shared meaning. In doing that ordinary work, they left a trail that later generations could follow. We are often tempted to think that only grand acts matter, big discoveries, famous names, monumental events. Yet, when you look at Sumerian clay, it is the small, repetitive, everyday writing that carries most of what we know. The creation myths survived because scribes copied them for class. The king list survived because bureaucrats cared about chronology. Star tables survived because priests needed to know when to hold rituals. A geometry exercise survived because a child did their homework. In other words, the line that connects us to that world is not built only from miracles and disasters. It is built from routines, from people doing their job carefully. That matters because it means the way we handle our own routines can have the same long echo. Maybe you are not chiseling stone or pressing wedges into clay. Maybe you are writing scripts, coding, teaching, documenting, telling stories. The Sumerians did not know which of their tablets would still be discussed thousands of years later. You do not know which of your words will outlast you. What you do know is whether you treat the knowledge you handle as disposable or as something worth carrying well. The Sumerians chose to treat their inheritance as sacred even when they no longer fully understood it. They trained students for years just to read the old language. They copied texts they found difficult because they believed those texts contained wisdom from before the Great Change. They built their cities and rituals in line with patterns they had been told came from distant days. You do not have to agree with their every conclusion to feel the weight of their effort. They were trying to be good ancestors, not by predicting the future or planning grand legacies, by taking seriously the idea that what they had received was not really theirs to waste. If Sumer really was a salvage operation, if its people were carefully reconstructing a toolkit from an earlier age, then they were living with a responsibility we can recognize. They were the bridge between a broken past and an unknown future. So are we. We stand in a world that knows more about the fabric of reality than any previous culture we can name. We can see to the edge of the visible universe. We can map the genome. We can track storms from orbit. We can talk across oceans in real time. We also live in a world where information can vanish with a power surge, a lost password, a corrupted file. A world where libraries can close, where platforms can shut down, where entire archives can slip offline and out of sight in an instant. We are more powerful than the Sumerians in many ways. We are also more fragile. They built their memory system out of mud and fire, and it turned out to be more resilient than the empires that followed them. We have built ours out of electrons. It is faster, it is wider, it is also easier to erase. Maybe that is why their story resonates so strangely right now. A people who felt close to a world-ending flood chose to treat certain patterns and stories as worth anchoring in clay. They could not know how far those anchors would hold. They only knew that forgetting was dangerous. We live in a time when the rising waters are different. Climate, data, noise. The flood that threatens to sweep over us is not just physical. It is the sheer volume of information that can drown out meaning. In that kind of flood, attention becomes the new clay. What you choose to focus on, repeat, and pass along is what survives. If you are listening to this while lying in the dark, or sitting at a desk, or riding a train through city lights, you are already part of that work. The fact that you care enough about how civilization began to follow a story this far means you are not content with the flat, easy version of the timeline. You are holding the thread. Maybe the Sumerians were remembering a real pre-flood culture. Maybe they were not. Maybe their teacher gods were inspired by actual people. Maybe they were not. Maybe their myths carry precise technical memories under symbolic skin. Maybe they only carry the shape of older truths. What is certain is that they tried to tell us something they felt was important. They pressed it into clay. They stacked those tablets carefully. They prayed that someone in some far day would still be able to read them. That someone turned out to be you. So the next time you glance at a clock, divided quietly into 60 pieces, or look up at a night sky etched with patterns people named a very long time ago, remember that an old civilization in the desert once whispered a warning and a hope into the future. The warning was simple. Nothing built by humans is guaranteed to last. The hope was just as simple. Knowledge can survive disaster if someone cares enough to carry it. The Sumerian scribes did their part with clay and a reed. Ours begins with what we choose to remember, what we choose to question, and what stories we decide are worth passing on, long after the noise of the moment has faded into dust.